My name, for all of you who don't know me, my name is John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And I'm excited to be joined today by two of our good friends from the Civil War Museum of Kenosha. I have with me Doug Dammann, the Site Coordinator, and Jen Edgington, the Curator of Education. Have them with us today. Thanks so much for being here, you two.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, John, for the invitation. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And how could we not invite you all on, A, because you do such cool things out there in Wisconsin, and B, Doug has all kinds of great connections to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, including basically having my position once upon a time, and his parents were pretty influential in creating the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, Gordon and Karen Dammann, and we're continually indebted to them for what they've done for our collections and for getting the museum started. And so that's always fun to connect.
I basically grew up, John, with the items you have in your museum in our house, which is rather weird, but that's the way it worked out. It was great.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You never know how things are going to go. And I see we've already got a good number of folks tuning in. I see we got our friend Dean tuning in from Frederick, Vicky from Massachusetts, Mike from Rockford, Illinois, Lynn from Cantonsville, Maryland. We're already getting a number of folks tuning in. Excellent. Especially shout out to Mike being from Illinois. Myself and Doug are originally from Illinois. Jen, I didn't ask where you were from originally.
I'm originally from outside Detroit, Michigan.
Okay, so that's close enough to the Midwest.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which is, of course, our topic of conversation today, which we'll get to in just a moment. Everyone that's tuned in so far, go ahead and let us know where you're from in the comments. Take this time before we get started to go ahead and like the video. I promise you'll like it. At least I hope you will. Like the video, maybe even give us a heart. Perhaps share the video. Tell your friends about it so we can get more eyes on the on this stream here. And if you have a question at any point during the stream, go ahead and drop it in the comments. I'll be keeping an eye on it. Jen and Doug, I don't believe can see the comments, but I'll keep a sharp eye on the comment page there. So go ahead and comment with that. And if you like these videos, it's been so fun getting to see people tune in to these streams here. If you like these videos, go ahead and if you're like them, share them, like I said. But if you're able to, we'd love to have you consider becoming a member, either of our museum or of the Civil War Museum of Kenosha. I know they're working hard during this time of quarantine, like we are. So please consider supporting one or both of our institutions. Or if you don't feel like you can do a membership at this time, even just a small donation makes really a big difference. So please consider doing that if you can. And I see we got a handful of Midwesterners tuning in. Sherry from Kansas City, Marie from Ravenna, Ohio. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Several people from Pennsylvania here. So we're getting a number of folks joining in. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get into this. And I want to turn the floor over to you two. Talk a bit about your museum and your mission for those who might not be familiar with it.
Sure. Jen, I guess I'll start and then we can fill in the gaps. As John mentioned, we're located in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and maybe some of you may not be exactly familiar with where that is. We're right on Lake Michigan in the extreme southeast corner of the state of Wisconsin. Roughly, on a good day, an hour and 15 minutes north of Chicago, and maybe about a 45-minute drive to downtown Milwaukee. So we're right on Lake Michigan, in between the two major cities there. And our museum, really the mission statement and the scope really revolves around the story of the Civil War, but through the lens of the soldiers and communities and civilians and the people who lived in the 7 states of the upper Midwest at that time. And when we say the 7 states of the upper Midwest, it's Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota. So it's not just a Wisconsin story. It's a wider scope on that. And Jen, I'm sure you've experienced this. A lot of times people will come to the museum assuming that the story is simply about the state of Wisconsin, but we cover a wider range of territory than just Wisconsin.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting opportunity for us because we're able to tell such a wide scope, but a narrow focus at our museum. So we're able to talk about the American Indians that lived here and still do to this day, communities of free African Americans, the women that were here. And so we really have been able to tell a lot of these social history stories that are often overlooked in textbooks that you hear growing up.
Yeah, and I think one of the main reasons that I think the building, back in 2005, we've been open since 2009 to the public. I arrived here in late 2007. The building was being built. It's a brand new building, and we are owned and operated by the city of Kenosha. We are a department of the city, just like the fire department or police department, streets. So we're owned and operated by the city, and we're one of 3 museums on our campus here in Kenosha. The oldest is about an 85-year history. It's the Kenosha Public Museum, has an art and natural history focus. And then our 3rd museum is a dinosaur discovery museum. We partner with Carthage College, which is a 4-year liberal arts institution in Kenosha. We partner with their paleontology department. So the building itself was built and opened in 2009. And the only thing it's ever been is a museum. We didn't take a historic structure or a historic home and repurpose it as a museum. It was constructed by the city specifically to be a museum. So in that regard, we're very lucky when it comes to our exhibit spaces, our collection storage spaces, our ability to have classrooms. The design of it was perfect for what we wanted to do. We didn't have to retrofit another house or building.
Yeah, as cool as historic structures are, there's nothing quite like just having something that's purpose built for what you want to do. So I'm glad you all are blessed with that. Tell people, where can viewers find more info on the digital programming that you guys have been doing during the pandemic?
Yeah, we do have a website. So the Civil War Museum is our Facebook page too, and all of our digital engagements, so short videos, our Second Friday lectures, which happen every month, have been moved to our Facebook page. So again, that's the Civil War Museum. And we do have a special Facebook page for educators too. So that's the Civil War Museum Education. And both of those are on Facebook. We also have our videos on our YouTube channel, which is the Kenosha Public Museum's YouTube channel. So you can catch them there too.
As Jen said, like every other museum and institution over the past 9-10 weeks, we've been converting a lot of our programming to the digital platforms, reaching out, trying to do at-home activities, trying to stay up with teachers and schools and help them with their curriculum needs, with their classroom needs. And so I guess the one positive out of all of this, John, and I'm sure this is the way it's been for you and Frederick, is it's kind of forced our hand a little bit to think more about the digital platforms, obviously very quickly, almost overnight, to convert a lot of our programming. But there have been a lot of positives to it as well. We've expanded our scope. We've got people from all over the country and all over the world now tuning into our programming. Whereas before, if you couldn't physically make it to the site, you might have missed out on the lecture or the program. So that's been, I guess, positive of all of this, and something that we'll be looking to increase upon and improve upon as we move forward out of this.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's something that we've noticed as well. I mean, of course, we've done, these series of live streams throughout the the pandemic. And, you know, a lot of them, not all, but a number of them were originally conceived of as, you know, conference room presentations, you know, lectures and things, which, you know, we would have drawn a, you know, decent crowd from the local folks and, you know, people in the area. But, you know, now we've been, you know, at any one time pretty regularly getting, you know, 80 to 100 people tuning in, which, I mean, we just can't fit in our conference room. So, I mean, it's bigger than, you know, than we would have expected. And that's been fun to see. And it's been doubly fun to see, you know, some of the same folks kind of tuning in every time and kind of starting to recognize new faces and friends out there that tune in for all of this. And you reminded me, those of you watching, you've heard me say, please like our Facebook page and YouTube channel, subscribe to our YouTube channel for some of the latest content. If you haven't done so, go do so now. And if you've already done so, take this time to go do that with the Civil War Museum of Kenosha. Go like their Facebook page and subscribe to their YouTube channel. As if we weren't putting out enough good stuff, there's even more good stuff out there, as I'm sure a number of you have already encountered. And if you're watching this and you're you are just discovering the National Museum of Civil War Medicine via the Civil War Museum of Kenosha, it's nice to see you. So with all that said, let's get into some of the historical stuff here. Talk a little bit about the situation in the upper Midwest, or in the Midwest on the eve of the Civil War. What were things like there, as opposed to, you know, kind of the East Coast narratives that I think we're perhaps a little bit more familiar with?
It's an interesting story, and I'll start with it's one of immigrants. I think people are surprised to think of the upper Midwestern population as being so immigrant heavy here in our area, both foreign-born immigrants and native-born immigrants within the United States moving to the upper Midwest. And I'll use Wisconsin as an example. In 1860, Wisconsin's population was about 775,000 people. 1/3 of that population was foreign-born. And so for the biggest immigrant populations, foreign-born immigrants living in Wisconsin at that time were people of German descent or Irish descent. And if any of your viewers are familiar with Milwaukee and the architecture and the breweries in Milwaukee, that's obviously not a surprise that the German immigrants dominated the landscape there. So we have a very diverse population, both with foreign-born immigrants and then also people moving to this new frontier, this new area of opportunity from within the United States, and coming to find work in the upper Midwest. I often, when I talk to our visitors, it's almost like boom town, you know, when people are looking for opportunities, no matter what your profession was, there was an opportunity here in the upper Midwest for advancement. Or maybe land was cheaper, the opportunity to own a farm rather than be a tenant farmer was greater here in the upper Midwest. So that is certainly drawing a lot of people to all of the 7-state area here in the upper Midwest. So that's where I'd kind of like to start with that story to begin with.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, like I was talking about before, we do have quite a few American Indians that called this area home right before the Civil War and continued to after. And then also something that's often overlooked in this area is our role on the Underground Railroad. So when we hear about the Underground Railroad in school, we often hear about it on the East Coast and Harriet Tubman. But we don't really touch on what was happening kind of on this Western side. We have this great story at the museum about a young woman who escaped from St. Louis, and she was enslaved kind of a few blocks away from where the arch now stands in St. Louis. And she was able to purchase a ticket and took a steamboat up to Alton, Illinois, got off in Alton and kept going as far as she could to Milwaukee. In Milwaukee, she unfortunately kind of trusted the wrong person who tried to turn her Carolyn Corals in for money. And luckily she met up with some abolitionists that were pretty big in the Milwaukee, Racine area. So from there, she started on the Underground Railroad, going from place to place and hiding out. There were a few close calls. And then she met up with the conductor who was going to take her to Canada, named Lyman Goodnow. So Carolyn Quarles was 16 when all of this was happening. He had to take her, I know, 16. Yeah, it's amazing to think of the bravery that this young woman had. And she ended up going in the back of his wagon for a very long time until she was able to get a veil to cover her face, and then they could travel together. But they didn't talk much during their trip. It took about 4 months for her to get from St. Louis to Sandwich, Ontario, which is now Windsor. And he went back to Wisconsin, and around 38 years later, he actually wanted to tell the history of Waukesha County, which is in Wisconsin, and wanted to include their story. So he wrote her a letter, and she never left. And so she actually got the letter. She had taught herself to read and write after arriving in Canada. And she wrote a letter back explaining their journey together. And so the museum actually has 2 of her letters, which is so remarkable and so amazing. Wow. Because not a lot of Underground Railroad history is from the people that were using its point of view or their own words. So we actually have 2 of her letters, and one from her husband who escaped from slavery in Kentucky and ended up with married to her in Sandwich. So it's a great story to tell, and it's really an amazing artifact to have too.
It's an interesting geography. It's an interesting geography lesson too. Here we are in Wisconsin, and I'm sure people in the Washington D.C. area think we're just south of the Arctic Circle. Here we are in the Great White North. But for Carolyn Quarles to get to her final destination, Sandwich, Ontario, and Windsor is right across the Detroit River. You can take a from Detroit to Canada, or go under the Detroit River and via a tunnel. So when we're talking to students about this, okay, here we are in Wisconsin. Her ultimate goal is Canada. What will be her initial direction that she'll travel? And invariably, everybody says north, right? North to get to Canada. But if you look at the geography of Wisconsin and how she made it to Michigan, their initial direction of Lyman Goodnow and Carolyn was south. They went south from Milwaukee down around Lake Michigan, around Chicago, up through Northwest Indiana, and then across the southern part of Michigan to Detroit. So from a geography lesson and thinking about Canada and the Underground Railroad and the routes from the Midwest to Canada, the easiest and most direct route was to try to get to Detroit. And for Carolyn and Lyman, the initial direction was south, which seems very counterintuitive to what we would normally think.
And some even took boats from this area too to get around the Great Lakes that way. There's another story from the next town up where he was able to escape using the Underground Railroad and then boarded a boat to get to Canada.
What a fantastic story, and a useful geography lesson as well. Yeah, wow, that's just wild to have that artifact. I mean, that's really, really neat. So with the Underground Railroad, certainly an active part in that region, and with so many immigrants, in the region as well. How did the region react with the outbreak of the Civil War? What was the situation like?
It's really interesting because if you think about Illinois, and John, our home state, I think a lot of people who aren't from Illinois don't realize how long from north to south the state of Illinois is. And you look at the southern tip of Illinois, where Cairo, Illinois was a major rendezvous point for the Western Union armies, supply depot, hospital, etc. down in Cairo. Cairo is further south than Richmond, Virginia. And so when you talk about the immigrants moving to the upper Midwest, many of them moved from Kentucky, Virginia, Tennessee, northward, these upland Southerners living in the southern counties of Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois. And so with the coming of the war, you've got a lot of different opinions as to what this is all about. I think politically, if you look at the election of 1860, look at the returns of the state of Illinois. Abraham Lincoln won the northern counties of Illinois, probably from Peoria northward. He was pretty solidly entrenched there. Stephen A. Douglas won all of the southern Illinois counties, probably from Springfield south. The battleground states for that election were in the central part of the state, and Lincoln won the eastern parts, the eastern counties, the Champaign and Coles County on the eastern side of the state. Douglas won the western side of the state because, again, geographically, think if you're a farmer in Illinois, what's the quickest, easiest way for you to get your crops, your harvest to market? It's going to be down the Mississippi River. It's quickest, it's going to be the easiest way to do it. So our farmers, our citizens were really linked to the South. And when the war started, suddenly they could not access that avenue to get their crops to market. Many banks, I believe the statistic was, of the 112 banks in the state of Illinois, there were only 17 that survived the Panic of 1861. Oh, so the economy, the reality for how these farmers got their crops to market, politically, there were, Illinois, the land of Lincoln. You think Lincoln probably received 80% of the vote in the election of 1860. He only received just over 50%. I mean, Stephen A. Douglas got 47% of the vote. So even here in Illinois, Mr. Lincoln didn't have a huge mandate in that election of 1860.
That's a great point about those the states that border the other kind of slaveholding states, about how it wasn't just such a sharp line that as soon as you cross a border from a slaveholding state into nominally a free state, that doesn't mean suddenly everyone's 1,000% gung-ho for either Lincoln or the North or what have you.
Yeah, we've got a great example of that. We've got a series of letters from a soldier, William Welsham, served in the 30th Illinois, and his home county was down around where Jen was talking about with the Carol and Coral story. He's from the St. Louis area, but on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River, and he is writing in these series of letters that we have in our collection in 1864. He's with Sherman on the March to the Sea. He finds himself in South Carolina, marching northward after Savannah falls. And he's commenting on the election of 1864. And he is certainly no fan of Abraham Lincoln. He hopes to vote for McClellan in the upcoming election, but he makes comment that he's sure, he calls them the Abes. The Abes will be the only soldiers who are going to be allowed to vote in the upcoming election. So even within soldiers who were members of Illinois regiments, there were a lot of differing opinions politically about Abraham Lincoln.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, or fascinating, very, very interesting. Now, was there any sort of, so that great point about Illinois and those kind of the kind of lower, the more kind of southern Midwest, is there any sort of differentiation between that group of states and maybe kind of the more northern Midwestern states, say like your Michigans or your Minnesotas or anything like that? Was there a difference there?
One of the things I think for us in Kenosha, because we have access to a lot of the newspapers, and when we were doing the research for the exhibit, we were able to see kind of both sides, right? So in one of our labels, we actually have a quote from the Kenosha Telegraph, which says that a flag, the Star Spangled Banner, was torn down from a Liberty pole, right, in 1861. So we see that although Wisconsin often is seen as kind of joining the Union really excitedly, there's still people in Wisconsin and in Kenosha in particular that are not on board with it. But at the same time, we have an amazing artifact that is a handmade flag that the women of Kenosha actually gave to the first volunteers to come from here. So we have such great pride coming in on one artifact, but then we also have this primary resource that's showing us that not everybody felt the same way. And they actually call it a work of a Goth or Vandal that took down this flag. So I think that when we talk about each city, it's really hard for us to kind of do this blanket statement because not everybody felt the same way.
John, the election returns do show Minnesota gave Lincoln the highest percentage. He earned 63% of the popular vote in Minnesota. Indiana and Illinois and Ohio was much closer. But if you look at the number of soldiers that came out of each of the 7 states of the upper Midwest, Ohio sent the most, over 300,000. Your and my home state of Illinois sent over 255,000 soldiers off to the Union Army. And if you add it up, another surprising statistic, I think, for people who haven't considered the upper Midwest as a whole, the number of Union soldiers that served out of the 7 states of the upper Midwest, it equals just under 1.1 million. So, and if you look at the total figures, it's 49% of the Union Army came from the 7 states of the upper Midwest. So I often, when we're talking to groups, imagine that the upper Midwest with in 1861 with Lincoln's election, if they would have said, this war has nothing to do with us, we're not interested in sending troops, the Union Army would have lost almost roughly half of its manpower right off the bat. And then the other 2 big concerns from the upper Midwest that I think really supported the Union war effort, where this was an agricultural region as it is today. So a lot of the foodstuffs, the corn, the wheat that was being produced, the hogs, the cattle, the things sent to stockyards, the animals sent to the stockyards in Chicago that processed into the food that the Army is going to need to consume. Much of that came from the upper Midwest. And then this area was rich in natural resources, iron ore, copper, galena, lead, timber, all the things that made the gun stocks and the buttons and the bullets and the things that were needed to prosecute the war. A lot of that came from the upper Midwest.
Yeah, that's an incredible statistic, that 1.1 million number. And even if just 1 or 2 of some of those key states decided not to sort of participate intensely, I mean, that would have made just such a huge difference.
Exactly.
Got a question from the comments from Mike. I believe Mike, our friend in Rockford, Illinois. He asks, given what we were just talking about, this sort of differentiation between northern and southern Illinois, are there any instances of soldiers from upper Illinois and lower Illinois interacting, and was there any friction between them that you all know of?
A great question. I mean, if you look at the makeup of those Illinois regiments, often the companies are made up, raised in a local county. And so you're getting this mix of Company A might be from Winnebago County and Company B from further south. I haven't heard of any sort of friction. I don't know of any, but a lot of people do ask, did any individuals from Illinois end up serving in the Confederacy? And the answer is yes. There was a company, I believe, Company F of the 15th Tennessee. I believe that was the regiment that was raised in Illinois, and they actually went south and served with the Confederate Army. So not a lot. And then the other interesting fact is, I believe it was the 109th Illinois, after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, decided that that wasn't the reason that they enlisted in the Union Army. And they decided that they were not going to fight anymore. So they were basically placed under arrest and sat out the war. So you talk about motivations and what was driving these individuals. I don't think you can take a paintbrush and do some blanket assumptions that these were the reasons that drove these individuals to serve or to enlist in the Army, particularly early in the war.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, certainly that company from Illinois that ended up serving in the Confederate regiment, I guess that would count as friction.
Possibly, yeah.
This next question is really quite broad, and so take it wherever you want to go with it. We'll start with you, Jen. Just very broadly, what was the experience of Midwestern soldiers during the war? And I'm sure you all, doing what you do, have just a wealth of stories or little tidbits that come to mind. So take that wherever you want to go with it. Go ahead, Jen.
Perfect. So I like to tell stories that really highlight kind of underrepresented people and stories that kind of surprise you. So when I was kind of looking at this question, I actually found one of my favorite stories from the Civil War, and that is of Felix Baldery. So Felix Baldery was born in the Philippines. And he actually became, at 16, he joined a merchant sailing ship, and the captain was from Michigan. And so the captain retired 2 years later, and Felix just returned with him to Michigan, where he learned how to farm on the captain's farm. And so they lived in Michigan in a small, tiny town in the southwest corner. And he actually ended up staying out of the war for about 2 years, and then he enlisted. And so he enlisted in December 1863, and he enlisted with Company A of the 11th Michigan out of Kalamazoo. So he ended up fighting in smaller battles, several of them, but he was part of the siege of Atlanta. Shortly after that, he actually got really ill. So he was unable to do his picket duty. He was unable to help in any way. So he got transported to a hospital, and it turns out he had like a pneumonia and kind of fluid in his lungs. He wasn't able to really do much, and it actually paralyzed part of his body. So he could never, from being out and in this new climate that he was not really used to, he really suffered lung damage, but then also he wasn't able to use his right arm very much. So the war ended. He actually got released early. He returns home and he can't farm anymore. So he had to learn a new job. He learns how to tailor, and he ends up staying in Michigan. But I think it's amazing because he kind of has this designation of being the man that traveled the farthest to fight for Michigan in the Civil War. And I think that it's a really unique person that he was to come all this way. And again, a young age, about 18 years old, came here for a whole new life and ends up fighting for the Union Army and fighting for a state that was not his natural birth home, but he felt so connected to it. And then unfortunately, just the conditions that the soldiers lived in created this lifelong illness that he had, and he actually dies from it very young, in his 40s. So one of the things that I like to talk about with the students is just how hard soldiers' life was, how gross, how stinky, how, it's not something that we romanticize it with movies and everything, but it wasn't like that at all. And I think that his story kind of highlights some of that.
Yeah, between just the boredom, the boredom of being in camp and being exposed to disease. I mean, he, as you tell the story, he was very nearly one of those, unfortunately, astonishingly long lists of those who died of disease. 2/3, of course, of all Civil War deaths come from disease. Thankfully, he wasn't, and that he was able to live a bit beyond the war. But yeah, that's a great story. Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I love how Jen took the micro view of that question, and I'm going to approach it from the more of a macro view here. Oftentimes we'll get people that come to our museum and they hear the story of the Upper Midwest, maybe for the first time, even though they've lived in this region their entire lives, and they get really excited about wanting to know more, right? Isn't that the real power of coming to a museum and teaching them and hoping that they'll maybe purchase a book in your museum shop or go to a public library and check out a book or come back for a program. And they get excited about going out to visit a battlefield site. And oftentimes they'll mention, well, what do you think about Gettysburg or Antietam? And now, John, I'm gonna send them to Frederick every single time. I will. Oftentimes I'll tell them that if you really want to experience or see where soldiers from the Upper Midwest would have fought, don't go to an Eastern Theater battlefield. Most of the men that would have been from our 7-state region, maybe not so much out of Ohio. I haven't really researched where the majority of the Ohio troops went, but most of them would have served in the Western Theater, west of the Appalachian Mountains. So I, tell them, go to Vicksburg, go to Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Nashville, the Atlanta campaign. That's where you're going to see the monuments and the stories of soldiers from the upper Midwest. Gettysburg, Antietam, they're great. And don't get me wrong, I love to be there. There's a certain mystique about those places, and Frederick as well is right up there with them. But for people who want to experience the places that our upper Midwestern soldiers were, you got to experience the Western battlefield, and even some battlefields west of the Mississippi. I think people are surprised to learn of the role of soldiers from our region played in places like Kansas and Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico, that whole extreme Western theater being so much part of the upper Midwestern story. So certainly not going to tell anybody not to go to Frederick or to Antietam. My dad will get mad. He's a guide there at Antietam. He'll get mad at me for saying that. Or Monocacy, the one there in Frederick. But for our soldiers, you look at the state of Wisconsin, the 1st through the 7th regiments that were raised in 1861 were all sent to the Army of the Potomac, what would become the Army of the Potomac. The 8th, pretty much through the end, there were a few exceptions. The 26th and the 36th ended up east, but the majority of those regiments would have served in the Western theater. So that's my kind of macro view of the upper Midwest for our visitors, the Western theater.
And I have thoroughly enjoyed visiting a number of those places you mentioned, but the one conspicuous omission place that is near the top of my kind of bucket list that I really want to go to is Vicksburg, which of course figures prominently for Western troops from your area.
The biggest monument on the Vicksburg battlefield is to Illinois troops, and then the second biggest monument is to Wisconsin troops. So again, that upper Midwestern connection to Vicksburg is huge.
We have a great question in the comments that I'll kind of fold into another question I was planning to ask you all. Given that we are here, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, want to start bringing in some medical things here. Were there any doctors from the region who served in the war? And Sherry asks, what about any nurses from the upper Midwest? Any stories that come to mind there?
Yeah. Jen, do you want me to dive in on that one?
I can start with the nurses.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's one that actually we uncovered not that long ago. We did a women's history tour in the for the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage this year. And so we were trying to highlight more women's stories that we don't necessarily talk about. And one that I want to talk about is Anna Blair Etheridge, who was a daughter of the regiment. So she actually she was a nurse before the Civil War, which is pretty unique. She was a nurse in Michigan and also cared for her sick dad. And so she did have some experience. And then she actually enlisted one of 20 daughters of the regiment. Not very many of them stayed. And so she was in the 3rd and the 5th Michigan. She switched because she wanted to stay with the Army of the Potomac. Especially after Antietam. So she actually would go onto the battlefield, remove injured soldiers. She'd help injured soldiers. She saw battles in Antietam and 2nd Manassas. She actually was almost captured at 2nd Manassas. And then during the Battle of Chancellorsville, actually a soldier tried to hide behind her. She actually got hurt in the hand because of that incident, because he was trying to hide from the war, hid behind her and her horse, and she was injured in the process of it. But she is awarded the Kearney Cross for her work with the 3rd Michigan. So I think that when we think of nurses, we often think of them kind of removed, but this woman was actually on the battlefield attending to soldiers and helping them during the process, and it was almost captured and was hid behind, which is so weird. But so I think that, again, her story was really interesting to me, and she's from outside Detroit, so kind of felt that connection.
For me, John, 2 come to mind. I'm sure everyone out there has heard of Notre Dame and the University of Notre Dame. There was a number of Catholic nuns that came out of the the Holy Cross area there in northern Indiana that ended up serving at hospitals in Cairo and Mound City and Paducah, Kentucky. They were served at the request of Governor Oliver Morton. He asked one of the priests there in northern Indiana in October of 1861. And so much like I know you tell that story at the museum about the Catholic sisters and many of them becoming nurses during the war, there is, a Western connection to those stories here in northern Indiana. As far as physicians, we've got a wonderful collection here from a man by the name of Benjamin Franklin White. Benjamin Franklin White was the surgeon of the 1st Wisconsin. The 1st Wisconsin was a 90-day unit that was put together in April of 1861, and they trained not at Camp Randall. So many people in Wisconsin are familiar with, if you're familiar with college football, you know that the University of Wisconsin plays at Camp Randall Stadium. Well, the whole reason that it's named Camp Randall Stadium is that Alexander Randall was governor of Wisconsin in 1861. There was a fairgrounds there, and they used that fairgrounds for troop training and rendezvous for the majority of our Wisconsin troops. And after the war, the land went back to the university and they built the stadium there. But the 1st Wisconsin trained in Milwaukee. The 10 companies came together, and Benjamin Franklin White was the surgeon in charge. He was 34 years old, and he had graduated from Rush Medical College. We have his diploma here. He graduated in 1858 from Rush Medical College in Chicago, which again, John, your story, I think a lot of people are surprised to hear there were medical schools, at the time that some physicians went to, and very prestigious ones. Rush obviously has a well-known name nationally for what they do and the care they provide in Chicago. So White was that surgeon with the 1st Wisconsin. They were sent east. He was in Frederick for a time. He was in Point of Rocks, Maryland, not too far from where you're at now in Frederick. And when the 90 days was up for that 1st Wisconsin, they were back in state by August of 1861. Dr. White he was ill when they came back. So the majority of the regiment, about 2/3 of them, re-upped for 3 years. The 1st Wisconsin was the only 90-day regiment out of Wisconsin. Dr. White did not re-up. He went back to his practice in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, which was in the southwest part of the state on the Mississippi River. Fast forward to 1862, there's a number of Confederate prisoners of war after the battle at Island 10. There's 7,000 of them, and they need to quarter these POWs. About 1,200 of them ended up in Madison at Camp Randall. There was a short-lived Confederate POW camp in Madison, and Dr. White was hired as a contract surgeon to come and care for some of the sick members of those Confederate POWs that were sent north. While serving as that surgeon in Madison, Dr. White died at the age of 35. So we have from his family, his diplomas, a number of his commission documents, pieces from his collection, small pieces of his medical items, buttons from his uniform, etc. So that's one of my favorite upper Midwestern medical stories that we have at the museum.
Yeah, that's a great one and a very cool collection that you all have. What about kind of hospital facilities? So over the course of the Civil War, kind of large government hospital facilities end up being built, typically in larger cities for long-term recovery. And we talk a lot about facilities built in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Richmond, of course, with Chimborazo Hospital. What about, were there any kind of large hospitals built in places like Chicago or perhaps St. Louis or others?
Yeah, I think that our biggest story that we tell about hospitals or medical buildings is really the woman who petitioned for it. So Cordelia Harvey, who was the wife of the governor right when kind of the war broke out, but he passed away with a boating accident in shortly after the war started. And so he was going around to different troops and trying to boost morale and help the troops. And so she really took it on as her role to fulfill that role that he was doing. So she actually became a sanitary agent. She would travel from troops to troop. She was mainly on the Western campaign, and she would actually help in hospitals. But her biggest thing that she did, I think, is she petitioned Abraham Lincoln for hospitals in the North, because she felt that if these soldiers were able to breathe the air that they were used to, they would be able to get better. So when we talk about Cordelia Harvey, she actually has ties to Kenosha and to Wisconsin in general. And that's one of the stories that we really highlight. We actually have a theater program about her story too, because it is so important to our area. And thanks to her work, Wisconsin ends up with some hospitals that the soldiers who are recovering can go to.
Yeah, her husband was the governor of Wisconsin in 1862, and he actually passed away. He drowned in the Tennessee River after the Battle of Shiloh. He was part of an effort to take humanitarian aid down to the Wisconsin soldiers that were recuperating after the battle, was moving from one riverboat to another and fell off a gangplank and drowned. And so imagine the governor, the active governor of the state of Wisconsin, dying at a battlefield while the war is going on. As Jen said, Cordelia Harvey was instrumental in opening 3 hospitals here in Wisconsin, one in Prairie du Chien, one in Madison, and one in Milwaukee. I mentioned briefly, I think the ones that kind of come to mind, John, for me are the ones that the Mound City Hospital, which is down, on almost at the confluence of the Mississippi, Cumberland, and Ohio rivers. So important for the naval aspect of the war, but also a large-scale medical facility was created there. It was designed to treat about 1,500 troops at any one time. And so for those Western troops being transported up, maybe the Red Rover or some of those other hospital transport ships being dropped off at Mound City, Cairo, receiving the medical care there, and those Southern Illinois small communities, not like, you think of the Eastern Theater, Washington, D.C., the New Yorks, the Philadelphias, the large cities that have absorbed these hospitals. Maybe the smaller communities here in the West did the same.
Mm-hmm. And you briefly mentioned the hospital ship Red Rover. I'm going to take this time to quickly plug a series of 2 blog posts that are coming out on our site. The first part either is already out or will be out before the end of the day, about the Red Rover, one of the most notable and famous hospital ships during the Civil War, served up and down the Mississippi River throughout the conflict. So check that out on our website, civilwarmed.org. /Red Rover. Shoot, there was a second thing that you said. From the comments, going back just a little ways, talking about famous medical personnel from Illinois, or from the Midwest. Karen Dammann in the comments mentioned Mother Bickerdijk, of course, from Illinois, who talk about a notable person there. Let's just say a few words about her because she's just awesome.
Yeah, Mary Bickerdijk, born in Ohio, is living in Galesburg, Illinois. I think she and her husband moved to Galesburg in 1856, and then she had some, I think, medical or nursing experience from prior to the war, from what I understand, and then was entrusted with about $500 worth of supplies to send down to Cairo, Illinois, and I think she saw the conditions that these men were attempting to recoup and recover under. And she's very famous for her work. Various quotes where challenging the military authorities and becoming beloved by the troops, so much so that General Sherman asked her to ride at the lead of the 15th Corps when the Western troops marched at the Grand Review in Washington, D.C. in 1865. So certainly somebody from that kind of northwestern part of Illinois, all except Galesburg in the northwestern part of the state, that we talk about quite a bit here at the museum, and a real hero, not only for the Civil War soldier, but also for the story of Civil War medicine.
Absolutely, and that's one of the the Civil War, of course, has all kinds of legacies, positive and negative. But one of the unquestionably positive legacies is just the sheer number of just incredible people, men and women, who are just so moved by compassion to help others. And luminaries like Clara Barton, Mary Bickerdijk, and some of the other folks that we've talked about here today just loom large and serve as an inspiration, I think, to us today, to pitch in and help out in times of crisis, when and where we can. So drawing, as the war kind of starts coming to a close and soldiers start coming home, what was the experience of veterans returning home in the Midwest region?
Jen, you want to tackle that one first?
Sure. Well, and again, I really like the hyper-focused one. So in Milwaukee in particular, there was a soldiers' home that was opened, and it's still actually a place that exists, which is really amazing. And it's next to the baseball,
Miller Park.
Brewers.
Miller Park.
Yeah, Miller Park. Again, not from Wisconsin, but I think that, to me, so the soldiers were coming home. Some of them stayed. Cities were getting bigger around this area, especially what was considered the West right before the Civil War is no longer the West anymore. But again, a lot of these soldiers are becoming veterans at 18, 19, 20. They don't want to go home and live with mom and dad. And so they want a new adventure, and they're already kind of at the West portal to go even further. So a lot of the young soldiers actually continue to go west. The ones that are living in Wisconsin, like I said, there's soldiers' homes that are popping up all over. The GAR is very active in this area. It's founded in Illinois. So it's one of those that the brotherhood of the soldiers that they established in camps and fighting together is now coming home on the home front too. And there's getting to be these systems in place to support the soldiers when they're home in this area, be it a health system, be it that brotherhood that they're missing, or be it opportunity further out west for them too.
Jen brings up a great point about that. The VA hospital, there's a Blocky home still in operation in Milwaukee, created because, like so many upper Midwestern communities, a sanitary fair was held in Milwaukee in 1865. There was the Great Northwest Sanitary Fair held in Chicago at about the same time in May, June of 1865 to raise money for the veterans that were returning home. And we're so fortunate at our museum to have a collection of newspapers. The title of the newspaper is The Voice of the Fair. And what the newspapers were published for was for the Great Northwest Sanitary Fair in Chicago. The first edition, I think, is from late April of '65. Lincoln had been assassinated. And they're creating this fair. They're getting it together for opening very soon. And as the fair opened and progressed, you see 4 to 8 page editions being published maybe 2-3 times a week. And our good friend from the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, Mr. Dan Weinberg, donated this collection of The Voice of the Fair to our museum. We have every edition. And they are a wonderful resource about what was going on at the fair and how the different booths that were created, the different experiences, some of the soldiers coming home, but then also, who were the celebrity rock stars that everybody wanted to see at the Great Northwest Sanitary Fair? And it comes out in this newspaper that the rock star that everybody wanted to see and couldn't wait to get to Chicago was General Grant. There were all these rumors going around. When is General Grant going to make it to Chicago? General Sherman was already in town. He was a big celebrity. People wanted to see him. They wanted to hear what he had to say about the war. But boy, General Grant was the man, and everybody wanted to see him. Ultimately, the fair raised over $200,000 for veterans benefit. $200,000 is not a chump change today. It's certainly big money in 1865. So those types of fairs that sprung up in these large cities, like Jen said, in Milwaukee and in Chicago, were integral to being able to provide long-term medical care for these returning veterans at places like that Great Northwest, the soldiers' home that was created for them in Milwaukee.
Very cool. Well, as we start drawing to a close here, we've touched on a handful of these already, actually. But are there any kind of Civil War medicine related items in your collection that you want to highlight, just to entice people that are kind of intrigued by the story of Civil War medicine that might be tuning into this to come visit your museum when they can?
Mm-hmm. Jen, do you have any favorites that you want to speak to?
Well, I think the one that really resonates, I do a lot of the school programs. So the one that the kids really see and it resonates with them is we have a chest set in our medical area. And I know that that's not really related to medicine or tools, but it was what the surgeons had. And the kids actually find this really interesting connection where I think sometimes Civil War doesn't always connect with every single person the first time you hear about it. And so to see something from them that they can actually, oh, I know how to play that, or I've seen grandpa play that, or, have maybe a chess club. And so for me, and it's next to like the biggest bone saw in like, I think the world, obviously not, but it's really great to have this connection that actually opens doors to have a bigger discussion about what surgeons' roles were and what they carried and what they had, just a simple chess set.
I love that. One of my favorite artifacts in our museum actually is also a chess set that was carried by a surgeon. It belonged to, and the only reason I know this is because I didn't even realize it until, I'd seen it several times, but I finally put it together because I borrowed heavily from the collection of letters that is published. It's the William Child, the surgeon of the 2nd New Hampshire, or 5th New Hampshire, one of those two. But I had borrowed heavily from his letters, and I finally happened to, because if you spend enough time in the museum, you just stop reading the panels, as you all know. They're gonna go in one eye and out the other. But I finally read the panel again, and I realized it belonged to this guy that I've been quoting for the last year, and that was just such a cool connection to make. And it really kind of brings it home to you. It was like, oh well, this was something that someone relied on to relieve boredom, and it really meant something to someone, and that kind of personal connection I just think is so cool. So I love also that we now have that connection. We both like chess sets.
Who knew?
John, I'll mention something, and I'm going to plug your museum here at the same time. I know in your collection you have an image and a pocket diary from Surgeon Jacob Ebersol of the 19th Indiana. We have the transcriptions of his letters here, and the letters are so rich with information. And while it isn't, we don't have the originals here, and the next time I'm in Frederick, I'm going to make sure that picture and that pocket diary make its way back with me here to the upper Midwest. Aha. But I think the neat thing about the Ebersol collection is he was one of those physicians that was actively collecting bone specimens while he was in the field at the direction of Hammond and sending them back. And he mentioned several times in his letters to his wife about his efforts in collecting these specimens. And he even mentions one time that he was a caravan of, he was sending things back to Washington, D.C. from after the Battle of Antietam, and Confederate cavalry captured some of these trophies that he was trying to send back for safekeeping into Washington, D.C., and including these human specimens, specimens of anatomy that were being sent down to what ultimately became Walter Reed. And the letters that he wrote, just I'd be remiss if we don't talk about the Iron Brigade, being a museum of the upper Midwest. But having him served in the Iron Brigade, those letters back home to his wife, but then also his commitment to science and study. And I think he realized in the moment that what he was doing was going to be important for future generations to learn from what was going on. And I think a lot of us don't have the ability to see into the future like that and understand our role in history. or I believe Ebersol did. And I thought that was just really neat. And that was always something that struck me about him, and that image that you have and that pocket diary that you have in your collection there in Frederick.
Well, that's awesome. I love that. Well, it's been just incredibly fun having you all with us today. It was nice to virtually meet you all and to connect. And thank you to everyone out there that's been watching and commenting, and we appreciate you all so much. If you haven't already, and you did indeed like this video, like I promised you would at the start, please consider liking the video, and maybe even sharing it with some people. That really helps us out, gets more people to watch the video. And if you really liked it, please consider becoming a member of either or both of our institutions. Our doors are closed now, of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's one way that both of us can continue bringing this exciting digital content to you on a regular basis. So please consider becoming a member, perhaps making a donation. It's so meaningful to us, and we really can't thank you all. Can't thank you all enough. So thank you two so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
No problem, John. It was nice to meet you.
Yeah. So this is all of us signing off.